Yeah, okay. All right, we'll get started in the interest of time. Thank you for coming back or for joining us, if for those of you who weren't here earlier. My name is Cole Roskam, and I teach architectural history here in the Department of Architecture. I also direct the PhD program, and I was asked to moderate the second panel today, which is titled Theory. Theories of the contemporary, it's a difficult task to develop theories of the now as it is happening. This may be why, in Dean Chang's introductory remarks, he provided us with 10 buildings that conveniently stop in 2012. It also may be why, in Professor Frampton's engaging conversation with Jutao, he spent more time talking about President Trump than President Xi Jinping. Because to talk about theories of the contemporary in Chinese architecture, we must talk about events and reality since 2014 under President Xi, and the architectural processes, the effects, the consequences that have emerged and materialized over the past 11 years. They arguably include sensitive subjects that have in many ways chilled contemporary Chinese architectural discourse, arguably, and make our job today all the harder. Where and how does one begin to discuss the contemporary? When does it start? What are its parameters, its material conditions, its motivations, its impulses, its effects? In short, and to echo Professor Frampton again, what is the project of the contemporary? I'm afraid I'm not as optimistic as Professor Frampton, and as a historian, I also find trying to come to terms with the contemporary to be difficult. It's certainly not my comfort zone as a scholar, and so I found myself turning to other historians and theorists in search of guidance for these remarks. For example, Sylvia Lavin, in her essay, The Temporary Contemporary from 2003, writes that, quote, today, we can historicize and thereby produce the contemporary by relying on argument to make facts persuade a possible present into being, rather than by organizing history into a shapely narrative, end quote. She also writes of the historian of the contemporary as someone who, quote, is operating as a scavenger, picking and choosing from a past conceived as an annal, a disparate collection of events and effects, rather than as an archive, a coherent arrangement of causes, end quote. And so it's with those provocations in mind that I will move into the present and to try and bring the possible present into being with the panelists for this afternoon and scavenge through their presentations. Our first speaker is Professor Michael Hayes, who needs no introduction, but I will provide him with one anyway. Professor Hayes is Eliot Noyes Professor of Architectural Theory at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design. His research and scholarship have focused on areas of European modernism and critical theory, as well as on theoretical issues in contemporary architectural practice. He was the founder of the scholarly journal Assemblage, which was the leading forum of discussion of architectural theory in North America and Europe. In 2000, he was appointed the first adjunct curator of architecture at the Whitney Museum of American Art, a position he held until 2009. And his publications include Modernism and the Post-Humanist Subject, Architectural Theory since 1968, Architecture's Desire, and Inscriptions, Architecture Before Speech. I also will ask you to just hold your applause. I'm going to quickly go through the other two speakers, and then we'll have them all present back to back. The second speaker is joining us via Zoom. His name is Edward Kogel. He studied at the Faculty of Architecture, Urban and Landscape Planning at the University of Kassel in Germany. From 1999 to 2004, he taught as an assistant professor at the Technical University in Darmstadt in the Department of Non-European Architecture and Urban Development. In 2007, he completed his doctorate at the Bauhaus University in Weimar with a thesis on German architects in Shanghai during the National Socialist regime. From 2009 to 2011, he conducted a DFG-funded research project on the work of the German architectural historian Ernst Borschmann in China at the beginning of the 20th century. Professor Kogel researches the history of exchange in architecture and urban development between Asia and the West. He regularly lectures at the Berlin Institute of Technology and Bauhaus University, Weimar. He also works as a project manager for the website Chinese-architects.com. Our third speaker, who is here in person, is Professor Jinyang Wang, who's Professor Emeritus at Nanjing University School of Architecture and Urban Planning. He's written widely for architectural journals and other publications in China and internationally. He is the Chinese translator of Kenneth Frampton's Studies in Tectonic Culture, the Politics of Construction in 19th and 20th Century Architecture. He was also involved in the Chinese edition of William Curtis's Modern Architecture since 1900 as academic director and coordinator. His recent publications in English include Toward a Civil Architecture, Memorandum of a Critical Agenda in Contemporary Chinese Architecture, which was published in Global Perspectives on Critical Architecture by Ashgate in 2015. The Everyday, a Degree Zero Agenda for Contemporary Chinese Architecture, and Site, Program, and Tectonic Expression, Huali's Xinjiai Coffee House in Architecture Research Quarterly in 2017 and 2020, respectively, and The Local and the Multiplicity of Chinese Architecture in Architecture Asia, published in 2023. He has an anthology, volumes 1 through 3, which were published in Chinese by Tongji University Press in 2017, 2018, and 2021. So without further ado, I'll welcome our first speaker to the podium, Professor Hayes.
So thanks to Young Ho and staff. I have to say this was a very well-run organization. Thank you very much for the invitation. This past year, my colleague Shi-Ning Sun, and I have been working on the topic of architecture's inscriptions. Now, you know about architecture's inscriptions, even if you don't think you do. It does strike me that Tal, that both Kenneth and I have recruited the two old white men recruiting young proteges to do this. I can see WeChat and Little Red Book lighting up already about the politics of that. But let's not talk about that. You know inscriptions even if you don't think, because architecture, the very first architecture is in a way nothing but inscription. Architecture, and remember, in the West we have Hegel, who is the first who invented architecture history, and argued that because architecture comes from the earth and of course very much damages the earth no matter how ecologically careful it is, we call it an inscription in this case because it actually is cutting into the earth and scarring. But the notion of inscriptions, which is very old, I'll talk about, includes other things that also would be familiar, like the techniques of memory, or what in the literature is beginning to be called mnemotechnics. This is a word from Paul de Man, a philosopher at Yale, who was thinking about literary issues. But mnemotechnics, the technique of making memory, Aldo Rossi talks about this Roman amphitheater. This was originally a Roman amphitheater in Lucca, where when it was deteriorated and was finally destroyed, over time, it remembered itself as an inscription by being rebuilt, first as commercial, then as sort of residential goes on top. So almost organically, the inscription of the original amphitheater was maintained unintentionally. No one planned it that way. It's just kind of human nature to recall these genealogies into the present. So inscriptions is actually not a new idea. The way we're using it, though, is trying to theoretically be adequate to exactly the kind of time that Cole described. It's a time when actually theory, at least in the States, and I think even before in Europe, is almost, architecture theory has almost stopped being studied. Let me give you a very brief history just to sort of bring us up. So philosophy and history since Hegel has always evolved together. Hegel said he was a historian, but we think of him as a philosopher. If you get deep enough into philosophy, you have to start doing history. If you get deep enough into history, you have to start doing philosophy. That's just the way the thought works, at least in the Western intellectual history. What happened starting in 1950 and fully developed in the 1960s was anthropology entered as a kind of trio of history and philosophy. Once you start studying philosophically humanity itself and the human species itself, you then start studying the kind of products of humanity, as Claude Lévi-Strauss did, and that's when structuralism is born, in 1950s, 1960s. And structuralism, for us, would really be the first, what we now call contemporary theory would have begun with structuralism. And this will become important later, because what we're finding is that while post-structuralism as a body of thinking, which criticized the presumed certainties of structuralism and the presumed hierarchies of structuralism, and made the meaning that structuralism sought, the human meaning about human activity that structuralism sought, was regarded now as very unstable because of the way human thought itself works. It doesn't always produce the certainty of meaning. With that, architecture latched onto structuralism as a way of codifying and producing, codifying and producing architectural meaning. This famous book by Charles Jenks and George Baird. When I was in college, college level architecture, meaning was all we talked about, the effort to produce meaning. What post-structuralism does is make meaning production irrelevant. This is just not the point. And so architecture started to drop theory. As post-structuralism went forward, however, you get into more robust ways of explaining what we think is happening, and this is the interesting part, both in the States and in China. I'm not sure about Europe anymore. I just don't know. I don't think anything particularly interesting is happening in architectural theory in Europe. If it is, I don't know about it. So we find that very interesting, that somehow I would insist, and this goes, I think, a little bit against Frampton. I would insist that henceforth, if we're going to talk about architectural theory, it has to be comparative across. I don't want to use the word globally. I want to say it has to be comparative across regions, if not across nations. That the regionalism is a limiting definition rather than a opening, and it's the opening up a definition that Shanine and I are trying to facilitate. I decided during the first presentations to change my talk a little bit, but I do want to say the young contemporary architects I would have liked to talk about include Liu Yichun in Shanghai, for sure, Zhu Xiaofeng, for sure, but also Zhang Ke. People know Zhang Ke, right? Yeah. I think, and I don't regard Zhang Ke as a Beijinger. I regard Zhang Ke as more international. He spends a lot of time in Tibet and things like that. Yan Fei in Shanghai, and Liao Wei. I won't talk about those. I'm going to narrow down the presentation to a single architect to save time and maybe open up a little more possibility of discussion. The single architect. Young Ho's Rear Window. This is a project that began, I think, in the mid-'80s, and the interesting thing is it continued up until very recently, when it is the product of a full installation, and it got built in models and mocked up. So even though I wouldn't say architects may not even know a Rear Window, I think it's one of the most important projects, and it's certainly important for us. Though the inscription of, let's don't call it window yet, let's call it aperture. The inscription of the aperture is definite, it's cross-medial, because it's referring to film, it's using drawing, it's using a kind of pseudo-perspective drawing. I don't mean pseudo in a negative way, I mean to describe it like Young Ho did. It's not really perspective, it's sort of axonometric sort of perspective. But it also is expansive insofar as it actually weaves together issues of vision and desire. Rear Window was a lot about voyeurism and the kind of scope, we call it scopophilia, the desire for for vision. It also, but it is a double hung window. What I'm going to argue is that the recursivity, the repetition, and also the modulation of the image, the draw. This is again where you draw it in perspective, but then you also have to cast the shadow in perspective, and then you have to cast the shadow that it makes on itself. These are very complicated visual techniques, as have already been said, and they're all in an attempt, I think, not to. I think in an attempt to destroy the referential dimension. It doesn't refer to a window. It actually deconstructs how we look at and through windows, I think. It doesn't produce meaning. It shows how difficult meaning actually is to produce. So on the one hand, there's this almost fanciful array of uh, uh, yeah, fanciful array of adjusted and transformed sort of mini scenarios. And the film Rear Window is also these kind of mini scenarios. So what I'm calling the scenarios, you can see better where they actually begin to get assigned architectural functions. And you can see a kind of activity, almost a kind of narrative of daily life, perhaps, as Rear Window, the film, is too projected here. A formal motif is repeated across these windows, and as the items turn into a series and they almost begin to form what theorists call a combinatory. It's a set of rules and protocols that make up a structurally coherent set altogether. It's kind of like the more you experience it, you start to learn what the rules of the game are. By experiencing it that way, it also starts to become self-referential. It starts to create its own world that is not the referential world of Charles Jenks and George Baird that refer to things. Oh, that's what I needed was this. That also with Jenks, Ronchamp has to refer to something in the real world which is recognizable and which feels satisfyingly concrete and stable in order to produce this meaning. And it does become cartoon-like, I think, even as a result. That's not what I think Young Ho is trying to do. What we think Young Ho is trying to do is what we call an exercise an exercise in allographics. Allographics is a word, one meaning of it comes from the study of rubbings, of calligraphy and rubbings in Chinese art. It's a specifically technical term for looking at rubbings in calligraphy by looking at all of the possible variations of a single letter, okay? So what does that do to that letter? Where is that letter? It's not there. The letter is this. What is this letter? Is jai, yeah. The jai it's recursive. It's repetitive. But jai does not exist until it's remarked, and every mark, every stroke that makes the jai is a remark. It is a trace of something that comes before it, but that thing doesn't exist. And this is what you have to think in post-structuralism. And I won't say we on some of this because Shining hasn't bought into all this yet, but I would argue that there's something about some of the work of contemporary Chinese architects. I'm not saying they know post-structuralist theory. I'm saying that they anticipate certain post-structuralist concepts that other disciplines have also found, mainly cinema and literature. That there's something, if you're an unreconstructed Hegelian, you believe in a kind of community will and a community spirit that is transferred somehow, but not directly. But allographic has another meaning, which comes more from Walter Benjamin, which is allegory or other writing. Allographic in English, allo is other, graphic is writing. So other writing. For Benjamin, allegory happens when an object, but including a letter, say, loses its original function and actually goes into a ruin. But once an object is ruined in Benjamin's sense, once its meaning has been totally evacuated and it becomes useless, its form is still available for reinvigoration at a different plane, somehow, maybe at a different level. Calligraphy, I think, doesn't perhaps, it doesn't mean to elevate it, but it means to, by remarking and repeating, you can also modify its expressivity. You can make new knowledge. You can make new kinds of experience. And I think what I'd like to attribute to Young Ho's work in this allographic condition is this reinvigoration. It's both a negation of perspective and a reinvigoration of perspective. It's both making the window into an object of thought and also an object of vision, an object of seeing. So it's moving knowledge forward in its very repetition and recursivity. So this is what I think allography we want to mean. And allographics is one of our main, let's say, modalities of inscription. It also brings in, because of the, sorry, wow, I am really nervous. Can you tell? Yeah, water maybe. You guys don't know what it's like to like stand here. Yeah. Thank you. I don't know if you know Rear Window, but this is a clip where, you know, this is scopophilia. This is becoming a monacular animal of desire, looking across. Barbara Kruger kind of makes fun of that. Your gaze hits the side of my face. There are a lot of feminist theories which take scopophilia and take Jacques Lacan's notion, what he calls his graph of desire, which sees the kind of visual, the scopophilia going this way for the viewer, but there's another kind of the gaze of power and control that comes back, and everything gets played out. And it's important for architecture that everything gets played out on this image screen, that it once dampens the power of the gaze going back to the viewer, even as it also registers on the screen the possible image. And this is a very, and Lacan is quite conscious that what he's diagramming is actually a perspectival condition of desire. Young Ho, this is more incidental perhaps. Young Ho mentioned this kindergarten. It showed a very different drawing of it, I think. Oh, that was the kind of one-point perspective drawings, right, of this building. But part of the way, as I understand it, the building was, let's say, programmed in the broadest sense, is through allographics. The enclosure, which represents either the courtyards or possibly the rooms, I'm not sure, gets tested out by using Chinese characters. My point would be, it doesn't matter. We're not looking for symbolization. We're not looking for reference. We're looking for a kind of anterior condition which must be reperformed. So we're looking, it's a way of making a very robust program that's not about kitchens and toilets, but comes from more just being in the world and the different modalities of being in the world. And he does it again in some sketches for the hotel, Human Hotel. and then he builds it. And I think this kind of comparison of taking what amounts to a pretty large piece of the city and treating it as a kind of calligraphic exploration of all the possible modes of experience, expressivity, spatial structuring, all the possibilities of architecture that can happen through repetition and recursivity and allographics. And this is, I think, the power of inscription to capture certain kinds of thinkings in contemporary architecture. I would, if I had more time, I would say a lot of this very similar things about Xiaofeng's work, and maybe we can do part of that in the roundtable. So these repeated, interrelated signifiers, this irreducible aperture or window, this signifier for window, we might think of as what of, for the moment, called a unary mark. Unary in English it means the oneness, the singularity of the mark. But the way Jacques Lacan uses the word is stress the oneness, that the oneness of the mark can produce difference. This is a post-structuralist notion that is found in Taoism. Lacan hired, I guess I would have to say, an expatriate named Francois Chang, who had come to Paris to teach. Lacan hired him to teach him calligraphy and to read and explain for him the theory of Chinese painting. And this is where Lacan gets the notion of this unary mark, which I'll actually have to return to. The only possible way to sort of account for this unary quality, this oneness, is to think of it as an isolated signifier. And what I mean by that, the linguist Saussure taught us that any language produces meaning through difference, not through positive terms, but through pure difference. So that whatever the word for cat is in China, there are many other words that may sound similar, and it just has to be meaningful as the word for a cat. It has to be different from other things that it's not. It's a very, again, it's a very inverse kind of concept, a way of describing it, but this is the way it's thought that human language works. And what I'm suggesting is that it's also the way that architectural significance works. So the theory of inscription would allow for these kinds of metaphysical, psychoanalytic, experiential kinds of explanations, but it also, as I said, it can be cross-medial. One of the things that Shining and I have had a lot of fun trying to explore is to look at how Young Ho's work generally, and it's just part of the way Young Ho is educating, the way he thinks. There's a lot of intersection of his work with contemporary Chinese art, especially we think maybe someone like Ding Yi. If you think about actually what I realize is the better comparison of this would be a sketch of the squares and remember when you were looking at the crosses and the central, the square and the 9-square grid. That would have been a better comparison because Ding Yi starts with a cross. It's kind of like a 4-square grid, but then he crosses that cross with an X, and it starts to produce. And the great thing about the Ding Yi's work, because it's always repetitive, even the physical, let's say when he gets tired, the crosses start to have a little variation. When he uses a different pencil, when the pencil gets dull. So this is the materiality, though, of allographics. The materiality of architectural thought is not how much, it's not the brick and the mortar. It's something much more that happens intellectually as well as, I'm not saying the brick's not important. what I'm saying, another form of materiality, and theorists call it materiality, is what happens to the inscriptive system itself. You could think of it this way, it's the physical mark, whatever significance we attribute to this work, and whatever changes we attribute to the different media. Is he drawing it? Is he painting it? Is it on paper? Is it on canvas? That's the materiality that produces signification. Halfway, right? Okay. Thank you. Yeah, this is a better comparison. This is in Ningbo, where some of those early projects that Young Ho showed get actually played out, developed, again, go through another recursivity and get developed. What I want to look at now is, let me just make sure I have, what I want to look at now are some of the effects of that. Just one more concept. What I'm calling allographics, another way of saying it, is it depends on the notion of trace. This goes back to there is no origin to an inscription. There's not the inscription or the original inscription. Derrida gives us a definition of a trace. So think of whether it's that kind of variable plan or whether it's Ding-Yi's cross paintings. Think of this as a trace of some prior form, okay? Derrida says the trace is not only the disappearance of origin, but it also means that the origin was never constituted, was never there, was never produced, except reciprocally by a non-origin, which is the trace. So when you make the jai, you're tracing, you're making, as thousands of other people have traced the jai, but the jai doesn't exist until you trace it. And that's what we call anteriority. It's the notion that there is no origin, that the only way of something being in the present is to repeat something else. And what it does is eliminate the notion of reference. Even typology usually has a referent, but typology doesn't have to have a referent. If a typology is developed, then it always existed in a certain way, just like the letter jai always existed, but it doesn't really exist as an origin. It's difficult to think, but I think it's very robust to, again, explain a lot of contemporary architecture. From then on, to wrench the concept of the trace from the classical scheme, what he's saying is like classical scheme of language, like a classical scheme of language, would be to derive it from a presence or from an originary non-trace, and that would make it an empirical march. But we have to think of that as being a possible anteriority. So we have to be able to think of this originary trace, or what he calls this architrace. We can think about that, but we have to realize it's not really an origin. It never really existed. This is really helpful when you think about architecture as an artifice. It's very artificial language. We want to make it empirical. We want to make it functional. We want to make it unconditional and consequential, but it's not. Architecture as architecture is highly artificial. All language is artificial. The fact that when you translate, the difficulties of translation come from the pure artifice of language, because you're translating something that has no real certainty. And this is what Jacques Lacan calls the unary trace or unary trait. It's his idea that Derrida is elaborating on. Now, once you have a specific architectural technique, and what I'm talking about is the laying down, it's not so much the laying down of the brick, it's the marking of a page in an architectural way, which is not just a spatial way. Architecture is about space, but it's about more than space. Call whatever specific and concrete, not that concrete, the actual operational techniques. In Heideggerian language, it's called the ontic. The ontic is the actual in-place real action that takes place. Once you operate architecturally and have this ontic operations and practices, the trace, if it's going to be an inscription, it has to produce ontological distinctions. The example of ontological distinctions, and if you think about something like that, the difference between image and picture, in the case of Ding E, is it a picture? It's not a picture, it's an image. Architecturally, a figure in ground, of active, passive, message and medium, subject, object. An inscription will produce ontological difference out of ontic operations. Again, that's the materiality of inscription. When Xiaofeng takes that inscription of the folded plate roof and keeps the horizontal the same, but changes the distance so it makes the triangle, the roofs go up and down, that's an operational technique or a cultural technique. And that produces ontological difference because it produces a different experience. It produces a difference in between inside, outside, things like that. Here's an example. The operational technique of flipping that folded plate roof has very ontological consequences in how we understand up and down, in how we understand inside and outside, how we understand ground and roof, or even roof and wall is in here, how we understand roof and wall. An inscription is also usually a because it's a repetition of something anterior to it, it usually produces a disturbance. And this is what we call the criticality of architecture. It's that ontological disturbance and even almost sometimes, as I say, frightening possibilities. Even here, gravity itself seems to be disrupted. Upper, lower, over, under, figure, ground. This is what I'm calling ontological distinctions. And it's all about how these things are inscribed and marked by architecture in physical space. Oh, and this would have been another, but we've talked about that sketch there is what I'm referring to. Again, the way Xiaofeng uses this example, this is Xiaofeng's photograph, and you can see the reduction of a picture to a mark. And to take that, if that's an inspiration, if this is an inspiration, it has to be remarked in order to become a new piece of architecture. And it's the remarking that's necessary. How much time? Real quick, Jacques Lacan had been to Rome 3 times, and each time he went, he tried to make a major sort of renovation of Freudian thought. On his 3rd and last trip, he entitled his lecture La Troisième, the third. It was his 3rd trip to Rome. Also, he was going to introduce in Rome, you see him drawing it during his lecture, he was going to introduce a diagram that was going to bring together his complete renovation of the Freudian clinic. And it was going to do it by, with this three sectors or 3 spheres of subject formation. When the subject, and you know, in psychoanalysis and Freudianism, you look at the way, hypothetically, the child's thought develops. When a child is pre-linguistic, before it's acquired language, or even when it's really an infant, the child can't even ontologically distinguish between itself and the whole world. Freud called it an oceanic self. It's just a fluid, swirling, I am everything. I am nothing, but I am everything. Its mother doesn't even know what its mother is yet. And indeed, what happens, and that's called the imaginary. And it's all about the body, because what happens is the child doesn't even know it has a body until it sees itself, its image, until it sees its image in a mirror. And when it sees its image in a mirror, it sees a whole integrated corporeal self. But immediately, because is that me? Is that an image of me? Or is that an image of something like me? Do I love this thing? Or is this thing going to kill me? And it raises its arm, and the thing raises its arm. And so it's a totally traumatic moment when of self-identity. It's also a moment that you realize that you are not your mother, or your mother better is not you, and that is doubly traumatic. And that's why you need a pacifier. That's why you need a doll. The pacifier is called an objet petit a in French. I just say it in French because it's not usually translated. Let's call it the object A, but it's the object small other. Mother's the big other, the boss, the thing I want, the thing that made me, the thing I have to have. But I can't have her, so I'll just settle for a pacifier, right? That's the object small other. It's also a symptom of that trauma. So Lacan says this is a signifier in isolation. It's a letter. Unlike the cat, which can interact with the other word bat or flat or mat, and it achieves its significance only through its difference from those others, the letter stays the same. It's pure material. It is pure language. It doesn't change no matter what the context. This is the unary trait, the trace of oneness. Lacan will also call it the thing. I have to be brief. The very important thing about this too is later Lacan will define architecture as the necessary cultural technique to make a place for the thing. And the thing can emerge as an idea only when architecture gives it a place to emerge. So this is a very important moment for architecture that has gone completely unnoticed in theory. When the child accedes to language, he enters into this realm, which is the realm of the symbolic. This is the realm of the body because he sees his body and understands that he is an embodied being. This is the realm of the signifier because this is the realm of language itself. But language also in terms of legal, of the law, of the rules. The big other kind of stops being a mother and starts being generally parental or even paternal and oppressive, like any kind of system, any kind of institution would go in the symbolic. It was in Rome where he also, for the first time, he's been talking about the symbolic realm and the imaginary realm for a while. In Rome, he introduces the third realm, which he calls the real. The real is not reality. This is reality, all of it. The real is what cannot be symbolized in language, nor can it be imagined or fantasized. It's chaos. It's horrifying because it's unknowable, and yet it stimulates and it generates fantasy by stimulating. It generates poetry by stimulating language and disturbing language. So you need the real. Yep. You need the real. And at that point, he migrates the objet petit a. He now takes it into the center and he renames it symptom. And this is all happening at the same time. Okay. Lacan, Francois Cheng teaches Lacan the theory of Shitao, which is that Chinese landscape painting depends on the ihua, the single stroke. And Lacan identifies the ihua, the single stroke, when brush touches the paper and the ink spills out, that moment is the generating moment for all these paintings. And Chang diagrams it in this book that I didn't have time to talk about, the empty and the full. This is Chang's diagram of that yin and yang actually imply a third sphere. And this gives Lacan, Lacan knows about the imaginary and the symbolic from Freud, but it gives him the idea of this third thing, which lets him understand the non-being of the very thing that's generative of the human subject. You probably know much more about Shital than I do, but it's fascinating for me that what we have here is a possible intellectual template of how a comparative intellectual analysis and even an intellectual history between Eastern and West, between, I don't like the Eastern-Western thing, but between China, between Chinese painting and painting that's not Chinese, how that comparison could be made. I think my time is up. Thanks.